Hey, welcome to Wildfire, what Wildland Firefighting can teach us about responding to destructive malware attacks. My name is Curtis Fechner, and I'm an engineering fellow here at Optiv. I work on our threat management team as part of our incident response group. I've been here at Optiv for about 10 years, and I've been working in information security for about 18 years now. I've filled most of the incident responder roles that you can think of over my years here at Optiv, but I spend most of my time doing consulting related to incident management and incident response programs. I started my career working for an antivirus company, however, researching malicious files and creating detection signatures for their product. So, this is a talk that I've wanted to put together for a few years now. I've lived in the Mountain West all my life, and fires are kind of a normal part of living here. I grew up in Colorado on the Front Range in sort of that wildland urban interface, a little bit north of Denver. Not quite in the foothills, but not terribly far either. So I'd usually see things like smoke from fires a few times a year, and then also firefighting aircraft from the Broomfield Airport, things like that. Wildfires were certainly a big deal in the local news, of course, because of our state. But unless you lived in the foothills or the mountains yourself, it didn't really necessarily feel like something that was a realistic threat, especially back in the 1980s, 90s, and even early 2000s. These days, however, I live in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and I'm surrounded by over 5,000 square miles of ponderosa forests, and surrounding that is just sweeping grasslands. When I moved here, I began to pay a lot more attention to the very realistic risks of wildfire that I was now more or less face to face with. This wasn't something that was unfamiliar to me before I moved here. These are mountains that have honestly been a second home to me all my life. This is where my family is from, and I have a lot of personal connections, but at the same time, living here myself now, that personal connection is a lot more obvious, and having to take risk into consideration like that certainly plays a big part of my life here and how I choose to look at things. So, these grassy hills that you're looking at here used to be covered in dense ponderosa pine forests like the rest of the Black Hills. These are just some of the 83,508 acres of the Black Hills National Forest and Jewel Cave National Monument that burned in the Jasper Fire in 2000. To date, this is, as of June 2022, the largest wildfire in South Dakota history. The footage you're seeing here is from about June 2021, about 8.5 miles from where I live. So as you can see, recovery is something that takes quite a bit of time. And also, this is something that's very close to where I actually live myself. So these reminders of what a fire can end up doing to the landscape are very close at hand. So even after 22 years here, you see a area that has burned where there are some trees starting to come back and things like that. But those recovery efforts on the part of the federal government and other agencies and organizations to do things like replant trees and even manage land issues like erosion or noxious weed control, things like that. These are all things that take a lot of effort, as the forest takes decades essentially to recover from the Jasper Fire. So the scar from the fire is something that you can see in satellite imagery even today. This really is intended to sort of illustrate how nature's recovery processes are going to take a considerable amount of time. To put this in a little bit more perspective, this fire only directly impacted about 1.5% of the total acreage making up the Black Hills, yet the physical scar from the fire is substantial. Thanks to the efforts of over 1,000 firefighters, many other individuals and agencies, as well as a lot of prevention efforts, particularly at the Jewel Cave Monument, these help to reduce actual losses to structures and keep them to a minimum, and we didn't have any loss of human life. This was a fire that was started by arson, and it's quite fortunate that the fire mostly burned in open spaces in the western part of the Black Hills, where there are relatively few people. There are some ranches and vacation homes, things like that, but better that, I suppose, than the towns of Custer or Hill City to the east or Newcastle to the west. So naturally, all of that clearly translates to a talk about destructive malware and cyber incident management. My hope is that you'll come away from this little talk with a bit of a better understanding of how we as cybersecurity professionals can really learn from what our firefighting peers have been doing for decades. Keep in mind that all of this talk is really sort of an analogy, and I'm painting in broad strokes with very broad subjects. So Really think about this as something of a panoramic picture of all the different perspectives that you might come across when thinking about incident response and incident management in the cyber domain. All right, so to start with destructive malware, a definition. It's pretty self-explanatory, right? It's in the name. But at the same time, that kind of oversimplifies that nature of what destructive malware both is and often what it represents. So what you see on the screen here, this is how I kind of personally like to define it in a sense. It's not really a dictionary definition, like I said, but it's also not something that will necessarily stand the test of time, but as I see it today, June 2022, this is kind of where I see things. I see destructive malware as an extension of a nation-state's military and/or intelligence capabilities intended to disrupt an adversary's military, political, economic, or research activities. Strategic end goals will vary, of course, based on a state's interests. So, there was a joke in here about the plausibility of being able to source a ton of hard drives being about as difficult to get our hands on as some high-end video cards, but that kind of fell apart over the last week now that video cards are pretty easy to find. However, technology supply chains and bottlenecks are still a real issue, and even if you've got your insurance footing the bill, it might be really hard to get all the drives you need to replace what was ruined. So, of course, with destructive malware, the goal generally, of course, is to render computers inoperable. So things like disk wipers, that's usually what we think of when we're talking about destructive malware these days. Usually this is something that's going to be targeting hard disk sectors like the master boot record. It, of course, could vary. You could just have something that encrypts data without really worrying about decrypting it later, sort of like ransomware. Ultimately, success is kind of defined by your outcomes, though. You're maximizing the cost of recovery for your adversary, and realistically, did you, if you're the victim, plan on buying a few thousand hard drives this year? There was kind of a joke in here about the plausibility of being able to source a ton of hard drives or something like that, and that being about as difficult as getting our hands on some high-end video cards, but that kind of fell apart, right? But overall, those technology supply chains, some of those bottlenecks, those might be a real issue if you're a victim of a destructive attack. If you need to replace, say, a few hundred or a few thousand hard drives, even if you've got insurance footing the bill, it might be hard to get those drives, especially in a timely manner. Different interfaces, different form factors, all that different stuff might be a complicating issue. So maybe think about that as another challenging factor as well when you're looking at this scenario. Your initial assumption of risk might be that you cannot trust those destroyed drives at all, but, what if somebody compromised the firmware or something like that? Something that's difficult to necessarily investigate forensically, so that little, that sort of worry you might have over something that almost sounds sci-fi, but almost plausible at the same time, but, well, do I need to just accept that risk and re-image systems regardless, something like that? These are some tough decisions that you might need to make in the course of responding to a destructive incident. So what's so different from ransomware, though? Really, this is about the tangible impacts on a victim's computers. It sort of challenges that perception of acceptable risk. Recovery might be really complex, really expensive. And this is not something where somebody's just trying to go in for espionage, collect a little bit of juicy information or something like that, nor are they necessarily trying to extort money out of you. This is purely about destruction and damage. You can't pay the attacker after the fact to speed up your recovery, right? Their mission is accomplished when they've destroyed something. So these are attacks that I like to say are perpetuated with something of a strategic purpose. While ransomware is inherently sort of a temporarily financially motivated activity, destructive malware is probably part of a much bigger plan. So something to consider with planning is how probable is the risk. If you've got a threat intel team, ask them. If you don't, try to find a good partner who can do some intelligence assessments and help really take advantage of their knowledge to inform you on the potential risks of some sort of a threat like this. Whatever it takes ultimately. Your intel sources will probably use some specific terminology. These will be words of estimative probability. And they're going to use this to articulate how likely something is. Is this highly likely? Is this unlikely? Things like that. Pay attention to the terms that they use and ask questions if you need to in order to understand why they chose to use those terms to describe the probability of this risk. When it comes to similar risks, ransomware is the obvious one. And I've already mentioned that a couple of times. I'm probably going to keep mentioning that as we go through this because there is a lot that is similar to ransomware, of course. There is, of course, a good chance that this kind of threat will be a more likely adversarial course of action, ransomware. But if you are the right kind of organization, the right kind of victim, I suppose, destructive might be something that needs to be realistically on that risk register. And then, of course, have we actually prepared for this? When it comes to preparation, there's a lot that you can do. I'm going to talk about this quite a bit over the course of this entire talk, right? Tabletop exercises and even just roundtable discussions are a good starting point for opening up some dialogues, talking to people within that context of a scenario and just thinking about the potential problem. You can take it to that tabletop exercise and really try to work the problem. If the threat is plausible enough, then it might make sense to integrate some of the destructive malware into your incident response playbooks or plans or something like that as well. Again, going back to that threat intelligence assessment and saying, how probable is this actual risk? So distribution vectors is just something to keep in mind. This will probably change over time. Like my definition, not really necessarily standing the test of time. How malware is distributed will probably change over time as well, and for destructive, it's really no different. Right now, however, what we see today, again, 2022, email and social engineering, of course, is still part of the equation. Let's be blunt about this. You could still just have somebody dropping a Cobalt Strike beacon somewhere on your network, getting that initial foothold into an endpoint, and then just running rampant from there. It's kind of hard to say. Software supply chain is potentially a realistic consideration. Let's look at Ukraine. Back in 2017, we had the NotPetya, and that was a situation where the Russians were using a tax software that was popular in Ukraine, and they compromised that software, and they used that to deploy destructive malware. So essentially, by compromising the supply chain that was unique to mostly one country, you could limit that scope of impact in a way that would sort of disrupt your immediate adversary without necessarily a lot of collateral damage. Somewhat precise, not necessarily perfect, some might argue, but it gets the job done. And something else to consider, of course, when it comes to distribution vectors, once you're inside, at scale, via enterprise tools, is going to be a significant risk. Think about this in terms as you would with the strategy with ransomware actors. You might have those initial access Trojans like Cobalt Strike, like I mentioned, some living off the land techniques, a lot of post-ex and privilege escalation, things like that. Highly recommend that you all check out the talks from Matthew Eidelberg and also Garrett and Zach's talk on certificates. Some of these are going to be really significant and realistic ways that somebody might be able to gain additional access through very stealthy means and be able to start working at scale against your environment. Automated tools that deploy software, SCCM, GPO of any sort, patch management software, using your antivirus against you, whatever it takes to maximize the scope. What they really want to do is distribute these malware binaries to as many computers as possible and execute them in order to destroy as many systems as possible. So just think about that as well. The easiest way for somebody to operate at scale is how they're going to want to do it with the least resistance possible. So some helpful mitigations. Setting fire breaks through things like network segmentation. This is huge. This is a CISA recommendation. This is something I would certainly recommend as well. Don't make it easy. A flat network that's easy for somebody to move laterally across is going to be pretty much wrecked by destructive malware, most likely. If you can segment things out and make it more difficult for an attacker to move laterally without having to go through considerable more effort, you might be able to buy yourself some time, disrupt the attack, and limit the overall scope of impact. Of course, execution denial, other endpoint controls, this is absolutely critical. Well-tuned EDR, not something you just rolled out yesterday, something with a good, reliable antivirus engine. I'm a big fan of having a separate antivirus engine if possible, in addition to the EDR to sort of complement it. Gives you two sets of signatures to work from, and sometimes one catches what the other one does not. Strong identity management, absolutely critical. Multi-factor authentication, things like that. get away from those service accounts that have a domain admin level of privilege with a password set back in 1998. Yeah, we still see that today. Summer 2022 with the exclamation mark, classic example of a horrible password that will usually satisfy a lot of complexity requirements. We want to try to get away from things like this. We want to make it harder for attackers to use identity against us. Extensive log collection, correlative alerting, things like this. All the stuff in your SIM, and yes, this includes your workstations and a lot of different logs like that. Absolutely vital when it comes to picking up the right telemetry to see these things happening. If you have the ability to roll out sysmon, at least to critical endpoints, things like that, and bring those logs in, even better. But also adequate monitoring staff. Tools alone can't do this. You need people. Two burnt out people can't do this alone either. If you have people completely suffering with alert fatigue, things like that, you're going to have a rough time here. And of course, don't forget the offsite backups, offline backups, however you want to frame it. Point being, if you do get hit with destructive malware, you are going to have to recover data from backup. You want that to be as timely as possible, of course, once you have somewhere to safely put that data back into. And also make sure you test those backups, because you do not want to find out that your backup processes failed and have been failing for the last 6 months without realizing it. And then finally, a little bit about recovery, just some additional things to keep in mind with destructive malware. When you're responding to one of these attacks, you're probably not going to be able to prevent all the damage, so remember your priorities. Maybe this is safety, right? Maybe you're working in an ICS or OT environment, and the incident's impacting that. Maybe you have physical life safety issues that you need to take into consideration, something like that. There's probably other priorities as well for your organization. These are usually going to be things in your incident response plan, things of that nature. Keep in mind as well, recovery probably not going to happen overnight. I would anticipate for an enterprise that was fully compromised and hit by destructive malware for most of the systems, you're looking at least a quarter, if not 2, probably realistically, and probably something closer to a year to fully recover. Maybe that's me being pessimistic. Maybe some would say I'm actually being optimistic with those numbers, but this is going to be a lot of work. So like I mentioned earlier, when you think about things like supply chains, how do I get 25,000 SSDs or something like that to replace all my laptop hard drives? Do I have multiple form factors? Do I need 2.5-inch drives? Do I need SATA drives? Do I need some serial attached SCSI drives? All these different questions, these are things that you're going to have to figure out if you're having to get into a scenario where things have been basically destroyed and you need to start replacing the actual hardware in addition to simply recovering some software from backup. All right, so now that we've talked about destructive malware in its entire depth, oh no, this is an incident management talk. Yep. So let's go ahead and go back and let's get us a refresher on some core incident response concepts, because really this is going to come into play a lot and you're going to have to work through a lot of your incident response plan. So let's start simple, right? A quick refresher on the NIST incident management lifecycle. You know it, you love it if you work in incident response, and if you're not familiar with it, this is the sort of primary framework, I would say, for incident management programs and incident response processes to be developed from. There's a few other models out there as well, of course. ISO is probably the most common outside of the United States. ISO uses a 5-phase model rather than this 4-phased one that you see here. The tenets of it are basically the same, though. At the end of the day, what's really important to think about with this kind of a model is that it's not an entirely linear progression. While there is that sort of start to finish, right, from green to blue at the end, these phases can also loop back to one another, often multiple times, depending on the complexity of an incident and what is kind of going on. So just remember that this is an ongoing life cycle. This is not something where it happens once and then you're done. This is something where you prepare for an incident, you have the incident, you work it, and sometimes there's that iterative process on the inside. You get to the end of the incident, but then you actually take the lessons learned from it and carry those back to the beginning, back to your preparation activities. something to consider, some of the activities that might go into the different phases here, right? So preparation. This is, of course, pre-incident actions. This might include things like security control, deployment, tuning, etc., vulnerability management programs, also training exercises, pen testing, things like that. This all falls into that category of preparation. Also, all of your nice, boring IR governance documentation, all of your infrastructure and everything else, that's usually considered to be part of that preparation process, getting all of that squared away. When it comes to detection and analysis, this is sort of that first half of the actual incident response process when there's an incident. So SecOps monitoring, probably some sort of alerts, some threat classification, some sort of a risk assessment to the organization to determine how bad this potential alert or incident might be, and ultimately sort of a notification, right? That in turn becomes a declaration of an incident, and you move into this containment, eradication, recovery. And remember those loopbacks on the previous diagram as well, because you might go back to detection and analysis from this, again, multiple times. But at this point, you've probably declared an incident formally. This, again, usually there's guidelines in your IR plan. You're trying to limit that scope of impact. You're trying to collect evidence. You're trying to remove the threat, get the bad guys out of the network, get the malware removed from the machines, etc. Start promoting the things that are going to be necessary to get you into that recovery mode so that you actually can recover from the incident and get back to operations. And then, of course, post-incident activities. So this carries back to pre-incident. These are your lessons learned. These are root cause analysis, remediation, and again, feeding back to preparation. Incorporate those lessons learned. That's absolutely critical. And this is one of the things that when you start thinking about destructive malware scenarios, something like that, you absolutely cannot forget to do this. You need to take those lessons that you learned from a very hard incident and actually carry those forward to make your IR program and your security program overall much better moving forward. So something that I think is really important, especially with destructive malware, but really for any major incident, is having that incident command structure available. So when I look at incident management programs, I like for teams to have a structure that is sort of derived from that National Incident Management System, Incident Command System module. So the NIMS ICS, because the government loves acronyms, of course. So the other ICS that we think about in IR. And what you can kind of see in this diagram here is a great simplification of it, right? The idea of having an incident commander with some accountability in your command staff, potentially some links back into other agencies, other parts of the organization. And note as well that the executive level actually lives above this. So the executives are not in charge of the incident response, but there are people who will be charged with it who are being held accountable by those executives. So that needs to be carefully considered as well. And then you've got subsections who have more dedicated functions. Some of these might be your sort of technical incident responders, right? Your forensics people and all that sort of thing. But then also other business sections, right? This is an incident that's probably going to impact the entire organization. You're going to have everything from your facilities people, your finance people, human resources potentially. It's an endless potential list, as well as also third parties, all these different cats that needed to be herded, all these different things that need to be wrangled. So having an organized structure of command actually makes this much, much easier to manage. So a few notable roles here. These are really just 3 notable roles out of a almost countless number, right? Every organization's a little bit different with how they structure these roles, how they define them, what terms they use. You might have a mix of these in your organization. You may have completely different terms where you're like, Curtis, these are just stupid. It's okay. They all get to the same point though, right? The idea is, in general, we want to have something like an incident commander, of course, who is in charge of the incident, that leader for the response. They can declare the incident. They're going to confirm the severity of it and say, this is how bad it is for the organization. They're also going to do things like define the communication plan. How are we going to talk about this? Do we need to go to compartmentalized communications? Can we talk somewhat openly about this within reason? They're going to define some of the tasks and the incident action plans, and we'll get into that one in just a moment. And they're also going to inform the executive leadership about what's going on here. So they're going to be dependent on their subordinates as well to understand what's happening so that they can carry that back upwards. Your incident coordinator is just as essential, however. And again, terms vary. I've seen different terms. I've seen terms like scribe used for this or anything else. I like to think of a good incident coordinator as being somebody who's a very good project manager. Maybe this is their actual normal day-to-day job as well, right? Project manager is somebody who can collect documents, schedule meetings, do all of that scribe work, assign tasks that have been defined by the incident commander, coordinate and help wrangle things so that the incident commander can focus on doing what they're expected to do, and they're not bogged down with a bunch of administrative duties, and that coordinator is there on the back end of it to actually help make sure that the meetings are scheduled, that the right people are being updated, and the right information is being collected at the right time. And of course, the incident handlers. These are sort of your technical boots on the ground, the different analyst roles. These might be forensics people, these might be intelligence people, other security monitoring. It just varies a bit depending on that incident. They're going to do your technical tasks, and they're going to report those findings back to your incident commander, potentially through the coordinator. There might also be some additional leads, right? You might have different sections of analysts, and you might have a lead analyst in charge of that who is ultimately going to carry that back to the commander. A lot of different nuance that you can get into there. There's no wrong way to do this. The important part is simply to define those roles and actually use them. So I mentioned incident action plans. These are, again, something that is derived from that NIMS ICS model. So these really are something that's meant to prescribe the actual response actions that need to be taken. When you think about things like an IR plan or even a playbook, yeah, they define some of the things, but they're based on sort of a pre-existing documented plan of action that imagines sort of a perfect world scenario. So the incident action plan allows us to actually take those sorts of frameworks and actually make it real, right? To actually say, okay, well, this is what's actually happening, so here's what we're going to do now. And these are not something where you just create one plan, done, boom, whole incident's over, right? These are something where you have a plan, and it's probably going to cover just the next day or the next couple of hours or something like that before a new incident action plan is actually sort of developed. This is where context is applied to the incident, specific containment and eradication, or even recovery actions are going to be defined. Some of the actions are probably going to be predefined in your IR plan, in your BC or DR plans, or even in your playbooks. Really, this is about allowing for a degree of flexibility for the variation of individuality of potential incidents, and these are something that can be modified in real time as that response progresses. As conditions change on the ground, we're going to need to change how our response looks accordingly. So when it comes to incident action plans, one of the models that I really like to use is the classic known as the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, and act. This is just one model for operations, for decision making. This particular one, pretty common, pretty famous, right? Developed by an Air Force fighter pilot during the Vietnam War era. And really, this is about making quick decisions in order to disrupt the activities of an attacker. So that's why I like it for cybersecurity as well. And especially with a critical incident that's moving quickly, I want to be able to actually have my team working and thinking quickly as well. But I don't want to do that by taking rash actions, making rash decisions. I want to actually observe what's going on in the incident or that threat that's being presented and actually determine what my options are and what I can use to my advantage to actually respond to that. And of course, decide on the course of action. And that's what I'm going to do if I'm the incident commander, and then acting on it, right? That's where the rest of the incident response team takes what that commander has decided that we're going to do, and they actually execute on it. So then at that point, you can actually observe the effectiveness and restart that loop. So that's why I say incident action plans are not something themselves that are just sort of a one and done. If your IAPs follow that OODA loop, then you're going to be coming back to this for different phases of the response, sometimes multiple times, where you're taking in that information, observing and orienting again, making another decision and acting upon it. But really, your goal here is, as much as possible, execute swiftly. You want to prevent attackers from changing the situation faster than your IR team can react. And this is not just for destructive malware. This is ransomware, any other kind of intrusion realistically. You start getting into things like APTs, you may have some other sorts of considerations. Maybe you want to take that sort of careful, considerate, don't tip off the adversary that we know that they're in there sort of thing. But for the most part here, this really is all about moving quickly in order to make an informed decision. A lot of incident responders will tell you that they hate writing IR plans. Some never have to do it, and some others love it. I'm biased. I fall into the latter category. I actually like working on things like IR plans. So this is my funnel of fun model. It's not related to the pyramid of pain model at all. I mean, triangles, yeah, some shared shapes, sure, but this is a different concept, right? This is all about just sort of giving us sort of a visual way to think about the different layers and hierarchies of types of documentation that go into our incident management programs that kind of guide everything that we do. So there's kind of those 4 key layers, and it starts at the top, right? So your rules, your policies. This is going to be your big one. Sometimes this is going to be an information security policy. Sometimes there's an incident response policy. That's supported by an incident response plan that defines some standards, of course. This is just a high-level IR framework. Everything's going to be very generalized. That's why your IR plan probably doesn't give you a lot of specific instructions. It's because it's a general framework for response, just to keep things kind of structured. Where it starts to get more detailed is normally under playbooks, runbooks. I've seen different terms, of course, used. It's fine, right? The idea is that these are guidelines, right? You're taking that framework defined in your IR plan and you're actually applying some steps to a specific scenario, to a specific sort of threat or situation. And then you can have your SOPs, your standard operating procedures, or just procedures, right? Steps you follow exactly. And these might be things where you have an instruction that's very generalized for a malware incident in a malware IR playbook, but then you're going to have an instruction like you should quarantine the threat or something, and you might have an SOP that defines for your analyst exactly how they quarantine a threat, things like that. So all these different layers, they all ultimately come from sort of that same top level, and then they work themselves down and get more and more detailed as you go further, but they're also less and less broad as you get more detailed. In air quotes, IR policy is kind of the boring part of IR planning. On the surface, this is a lot of the content that's going to be in your plan, or maybe it's somewhere else. It's going to look boring and official, and it's not going to tell you much. It's just laying out a bunch of stuff like, who's going to hold who accountable, if the chief information security officer is bought into it, things like that. Nothing wrong with that, right? If you're a technical person, if you're used to getting your hands dirty for a living, then you probably don't feel like you care. But at the same time, these are policies that you probably live by, whether you realize it or not. And it's important to be aware that these sort of structure everything that comes out beneath it and defines how your program's going to look. So this is also really important because it's what gives the rest of your IR program some real teeth, right? If you need to enforce a policy or something like that, having it as a documented policy is critical. Think about things, probably the most common would be an incident reporting requirement, something like that, where you say all employees must report an incident if it happens or something of that nature. That's exactly what this is. This is something that's defined in your IR policy, and that just helps us have some of those sort of business enforcement mechanisms that we depend on to set up those rules and hold accountability when everything else feels like it's going to hell. So the IR plan, like I mentioned, is really your overall framework, your high-level standards followed for all cybersecurity incidents. So you're going to take that NIST framework, for example, that I started this section off with. It's going to cover things like evidence collection, other evidence handling standards, things like that. Probably defines your roles and responsibilities. Again, using that NIMS ICS model, this is where you're going to define what an incident commander is, what they're supposed to do. It's also going to help you define things like communications and action plans, right? Where does that incident action plan sort of fit into the response framework? Who's going to initiate that? Also engaging third-party resources. When do you invoke your IR retainer? Maybe that's defined in your IR plan as well. But it also covers things like incident closure. How do we know when we're done and what comes next there? And that's all defined within that high-level plan. So playbooks are, again, something more specific. These are the guidelines. These are your roadmap for really navigating for those more specific threat scenarios. Malware, maybe a ransomware one, denial of service, some other generic hacking one, insider threats, whatever. These are all scenario specific. They're still pretty broad, though. There's lots of different kinds of malware. There's lots of different kinds of hacking, right? And usually, sometimes with hacking incident, there's some malware in there too. Yeah, that's okay, right? All of these different things are all just meant to take that structure that was defined in your IR plan and actually apply it a little bit more specifically to a given kind of threat. But at the same time, it's a guideline. You don't have to follow those steps exactly. Maybe you'll skip a few steps because they're just not needed. Maybe you'll have to make up something new on the spot and get creative. All these different possibilities exist, and they're all something that you need to consider. Keep in mind as well that a lot of times playbook tasks are things that can be performed concurrently. One thing that sometimes drives me personally nuts is when we start to number every step in our response for a playbook or something like that. I don't love that because it implies that you can't be doing like steps 2 and 6 at the same time, for example. So think about that as well. Just remember that if you have good command structures defined in your IR plan, then hopefully you can start to delegate out multiple tasks to different groups of people to execute on that all ultimately achieve the same objective at the end. And then finally, standard operating procedures, fairly self-identifying, I suppose you could say. Again, SOPs are sort of that click here, click here, click here, do this very specific thing exactly as written, do not deviate from this period sort of documentation that everybody kind of hates, but you usually get used to it, right? This is something that you especially see if you're just getting started in the field. If you work in a SOC or something like that, SOPs are your life, and that's okay, right? What that's meant to do is help achieve a very specific outcome in a very specific way for something that needs to be done exactly as written consistently, just in order to make this a more repetitive behavior. This also can help ensure, however, not that we're moving through things too quickly, but just to make sure that we're not missing an important critical detail that was essential to our response. So, with some of that NIST business out of the way, let's go ahead and talk a bit more about how firefighters prepare and how they think about managing risks, and see how we can kind of carry that forward into what we're talking about here. You might recall the title graphic that I used with this same sign surrounded by flames. It looked a little ironic, you know? But if you zoom out a little bit, you find that the situation's actually a little bit different. And it's actually more complicated as well. High fire danger. Sure, the fire's burning by the sign, but what you actually see when you zoom out is this fire was lit on purpose. These are drip torches being used, and this is really just intended to actually consume the fuels on the ground that are nearby to the actual uncontrolled fire. And this fire's been lit on purpose to help consume those fuels in a controlled manner and help to control the overall movement of the main fire itself. So something that's really useful for wildland firefighters that they have available to them that's sort of like an incident response plan is what's called the Incident Response Pocket Guide. That's this little yellow book here. And see if the camera gets it in focus. Yeah. And it's not very large. It's only a small document, ultimately, something you can keep in your pocket. And this really establishes all the different standards for wildland fire incident response. Checklists, rapid points of reference for common IR activities. It's pocket size. This is usable by crews and leaders in the field. It covers a lot of common hazard scenarios. It has checklists, things like that. If you're having trouble starting a chainsaw, it'll tell you how to do that in the field, how to troubleshoot that. All the different critical things that need to be known by somebody when responding to a fire, when they're not going to be able to just go back to base and go back and pull out a computer or pull out a book or something like that. Something else that, of course, is pretty interesting and relevant when you talk about wildland firefighting is safety. So 6 minutes for safety is sort of an initiative that's part of the National Wildland Firefighting Coordinating Group. This is all about hazard mitigation through risk management. So really, it's a 5-step process. It's supposed to take about 6 minutes to execute on for a firefighter. And this is when you're sort of initially responding to a fire, something like that, right? So you're going to have situational awareness, you're going to have a hazard assessment, hazard control, make some decisions, and evaluate whether or not you can actually take the actions. These sorts of things are really just meant to make sure that when you start your response activities, you're starting it with the clear head and you're actually aware of what's going on so that you're not jumping into things and actually creating additional risks because there were hazards that you didn't consider before you dug in there and started trying to dig a fire line or anything else related to that fire. Most critical is going to be the standard orders as well as the watch out situations. So these are very interesting concepts, and The 10 standard firefighting orders is an old concept now. It dates back to 1957. It has a very deliberate numerical order. This is one of the most critical frameworks for making decisions when fighting wildland fires. Much like the NIST framework gives incident responders an outline for cybersecurity incidents, the 10 standard orders gives firefighters something to rely on when they're working through their own incident. While the standard orders are conceptually different, of course, it's not a phased model. They still present a number of very important lessons that incident responders can adapt for use in a dynamic IR scenario like we're going to see with destructive malware. The watch-out situations are something that complements that, right? These are cautionary scenarios that are really just meant to drive mindfulness on the part of firefighters. The numerical order of these is going to be less deliberate. It's a lot more specific, right? These are all about just individual safety and keeping crews from making poor decisions. All of this ultimately is all about consistent best practices and risk reduction, which is exactly the same as what we try to strive for when it comes to cyber incident response. So these are the 10 standard firefighting orders, and we're going to go through each one of these individually and talk about them a little bit. But just at a high level, just to start off and keep this in mind, this is what they are. Keep informed on fire weather conditions and forecasts. Know what your fire is doing at all times. Base all actions on current and expected behavior of the fire. Identify escape routes and safety zones and make them known. Post lookouts when there is possible danger. Be alert. Keep calm. Think clearly, act decisively. That's something that's a challenge for a lot of us in incident response, of course. Maintain prompt communications with your forces, your supervisor and adjoining forces. Again, communications is another big one. Giving clear instructions and be sure that they're understood. Maintain control of your forces at all times. And then finally, fight fire aggressively, having provided for safety first. So again, like I mentioned before, safety is absolutely paramount when it comes to fighting fires. We don't have quite that same consideration with cyber incident response most of the time, but it's still something to be aware of as well. Even if you don't have safety as your primary consideration, there's probably something that's analogous in your organization that's just as important. So standard order one, this is keep informed on fire weather conditions, right? This illustrates how firefighters rely on risk-based decision-making activities to manage the incident. So as a force of nature, fire is frequently described as being unpredictable. Certain factors can be examined to inform decision makers regarding likelihood of a fire's path, which is critical for making those informed risk-based assessments of the incident. Weather conditions like wind are probably the most obvious among these. Wind direction, temperature, relative humidity, things like that. This might all help predict the paths of fire travel or flammability of certain fuels, for example, which is absolutely critical for both firefighter safety as well as public safety as well. A forecast the evening before a fire starts might inform the readiness of local resources. So a red flag warning from the National Weather Service is a good indicator that fires are going to be at a greater risk if they do break out of spreading in an uncontrolled manner very quickly. And so that scope is going to go up very quickly. This can also determine the readiness of resources among fire agencies. Things like temporary outdoor burning bans might need to come into effect, things like that based on that weather forecast. So despite this, however, of course, forecasting is still very challenging. It's never perfect and it's never fully guaranteed. While on the surface it sounds as simplistic as temperature and wind direction at the ground level, there's a lot of subtle factors and data points that factor into predicting weather with sophisticated forecasting models that are needed to make an accurate determination of the likelihood of a fire's path over the course of the ensuing sort of firefight. So weather's really analogous, however, to cyber threat intelligence when it comes to informing those risk-based decisions. And that's why I think it's really important to consider this first and foremost, both for firefighting, but also for cyber incident response, right? Threat intelligence is absolutely critical to being effective. Think of the weather as something akin to operational threat intelligence, although maybe in practice it's something a bit more like a blend of strategic, tactical, technical, and operational, depending on how you want to interpret it. Regardless of that, meteorological intel and CTI for cyber share a common purpose, as we're talking about contextualized information that's being used to inform decision makers as they make risk-based decisions. So it's important to remember that this isn't simply about the weather during a major fire or CTI during incident response. In both cases, we're talking about concepts that can be applied throughout the incident management life cycles. Our second order is about situational awareness. Know what your fire is doing at all times. In a cyber incident, think about this in terms of ongoing heightened monitoring. Think about staging resources to monitor the situation 24/7. How are you going to avoid burnout, too? We'll come back to that one a little bit. But it's really important not to lose sight of what's actually going on with the incident, but also to make sure that you're not focusing solely on the one incident. You're looking at the bigger picture of everything happening around it as well within your network. The third order is another opportunity to consider your threat intelligence resources, as well as maintaining effective incident command. So for current behavior, commanders are dependent on reports from their various section leads who are executing really on specific tasks. For expected behavior, informed assessments of probable risk must be made either by the intel team or other individuals with correct knowledge to inform your assessment of risk. If you think about firefighting, a lot of the focus is on containing the threat, not really eradicating it, not necessarily dumping water on the fire to put it out immediately. In the context of destructive malware, objective might be similar. Once that code's been run, the destruction has either happened or is imminent, so our decisions are going to be made based on the information that is as close to real time as possible. We need to move quickly. Do we know more about this threat now? Are there any updates from the intel team on forecasting changes, and is the adversary telegraphing anything else? These are all things to keep in mind. So the physical escape routes with the fourth order are something that are less of a concern, of course. OT environmental what-if scenarios notwithstanding, of course. But think about your BCP and your DR plans. These are our safety zones for a destructive incident. Do we have a clear path to execution? Does the IR effort complement these processes? Did we make sure that our BCDR or our crisis management plans aren't going to conflict with the IR plan? All these different outs, all these different ways of helping to ensure that we've got some barriers of control here. This is important. They all need to work together. Another way to think about these safety zones or escape routes, perhaps this is where we consider some of our third-party support. This could be IR retainers, maybe it's our cyber insurance partners, or both. And there could be others. Outside situations, law enforcement, other government agencies, whatever the case might be. As we get to standard order number 5, we're looking at something that was fairly similar to the second one, maintaining situational awareness. In a fire scenario, you want to make sure that your flanks aren't uncovered. Imagine a hand crew working a fire line and being taken surprised by a spot fire that got behind them. That would be really bad. That could potentially trap these firefighters. It could put their lives at risk. And ultimately, that has a very negative impact on firefighting. In a cyber incident, you still need to watch your flanks. Very rarely is there just one cyber incident going on. Your normal security events might still be happening. Your users might still be getting, spear phishing attacks or other things. So the other bad guys aren't taking a break just because you're having a really bad day. So always keep that in mind. Keep your lookouts working on monitoring your flanks and not just getting tunnel vision for the immediate incident at hand. That sixth order now, be alert, keep calm, think clearly, act decisively. I like to think that this takes us back to the OODA loop, and that sort of almost there's this notion of observe everything while admiring nothing. There's going to be a lot going on with a major incident, and just like with the fire, having a reliable leadership structure over the course of the incident is essential to executing on the order. Commanders need to set the right tone for their teams and maintain a focused calm in order to be effective. Time is absolutely the essence, but rash decisions are going to create additional risks that might have been avoidable. Remember your escape routes as well and use your BCDR plans and your third-party resources when you need extra help. And something else to consider as well. Did you task all of your team with all-nighters and keep everyone in a war room tucked away in the corner of the 4th floor on your office? Well, I hope not. Because that's a good way to burn out your responders and negate every aspect of the 6th order. Few people can think clearly for very long if they aren't getting any rest. Having an incident command team, again, is absolutely crucial. We saw this with the 6th order, and this carries over into the 7th as well. But maintaining open comms is absolutely just as critical as the leadership structure itself. The idea really is to divide and conquer among multiple resources. There's lots of different efforts that need to be undertaken to respond to a cyber incident, just as there is with the wildfire. You have to remember that uncoordinated efforts can create new hazards and set back the actual pace of response. While an incident commander for the overall incident can be held accountable by senior leaders, the executives, things like that, they also need their own subordinate commanders sometimes who can have authority delegated upon them so that they can supervise more discrete activities that tie back to the overall incident response process. So when delegating authority, it's absolutely essential to keep your channels of communication open. For firefighters, this might be radios, but for your IR team, maybe it's a temporary Slack instance, or maybe it's Signal or something. Use the resources that make sense to accomplish your mission. The point is, communicate. Delegating authority is crucial, but leaders should not assume that everyone on the response team always knows exactly what to do and when, even if it's documented in a playbook or an SOP. Commanders, as well as any delegated sub-commanders or supervisors, really need to set clear expectations based on the objective that they're tasked with. Don't assume that people know what the outcome that you're going for necessarily is, or what good looks like, or what damage you're trying to avoid. If you're in command and you know what your priorities are, you should share those with those who are working with you. For firefighters, life safety is usually the greatest priority. For a cyber incident, it's probably going to be something else most of the time. Knowing that priority, again, is absolutely critical because that's going to shape those instructions that you're giving to your subordinates. For a destructive malware incident, your priority is probably going to vary. This depends on the organization. Like I've said before, all of these priorities, things like that, these are still things that should be defined in your incident response plan as well. And as we get to the 9th out of these 10 orders, leaders need to stay involved. Barking orders doesn't mean that you can have those orders be immediately executed upon and the incident commander can go back to their cubicle or their office and pound energy drinks because they're dead tired. Again, the incident commander themselves can't necessarily run everything. That's why they have the coordinator. That's why we want to delegate that authority. Section commanders, those other sub-leaders, should be able to translate your commander's intent back to their own teams and that team's specific mission. So section commanders can help the team greatly in this area by ensuring that their team understands how their efforts factor into the greater response effort. And finally, when delegating authority, commanders really must hold those subordinate leaders accountable. If the commander fails to articulate their vision clearly, subordinates should request clarification as well, as it's going to be very difficult for a team that's been tasked with something to actually do it if they don't fully understand it. So as we get to the 10th order here, we're tying everything back together. We've taken all these other things into consideration. Now it's time to fight that fire aggressively. Don't hesitate. Don't let up. Move as quickly as we can. Keep all those other factors in mind. Continue to communicate. Maintain our incident command and everything else. Contain that threat as rapidly as we can so that we can minimize the overall scope of damage so that we can start to move into recovery mode as quickly as possible. So like I mentioned earlier, the watch out situations, these are not something I'm going to cover in nearly as much depth, but these are sort of those hazards, sort of those, I don't want to say dumb mistakes that people can make, but they're things that might be indicators of negligence or lead to accidents, things that are easily avoidable that can really create a lot of headaches. These watch out situations are very fire specific for the most part. These are not things that translate very directly to cyber. But that doesn't mean that we can't have our own watch out scenarios for malware. If we look at things, you should come up with your own watch out scenario list, right? Don't let me be the only authority who tells you what your watch out scenarios are. This is going to be very organization dependent. Personally, I believe that threat intelligence is absolutely critical. You need to be aware of the big picture, understand the scope of the incident, and don't miss the forest for the trees, right? Don't fixate on small details and miss the big picture. Establish your contingency plans and know how and when to fall back on them. Get help from people on the ground who have context, internal business owners and SMEs. Don't ignore these people. They're all probably going to be tied into your incident response plan somehow. Take advantage of their knowledge. Ensure that your instructions and assignments are clear, though. Again, these come back to standard orders. These are things where we constantly see incident response on the cyber side struggle because there's not a lot that's being done to clarify who's expected to do what and when, or what the outcomes really are expected to be or why. Maintain situational awareness, of course. If conditions change, you need to adapt to the challenge. Don't assume that that incident's going to remain static. Communicate at all costs is absolutely it. But then also rest. Like we saw with the watch out situations, rest is critical. You don't want somebody to take a nap on the fire line, of course. That's a big safety issue. But at the same time, having fatigued staff, like I've mentioned before, is a huge risk when it comes to cyber incidents. There's always that temptation for everybody to start pulling all-nighters and to pull in the entire team to jump on this as fast as they can. But typically, there's a lot of that's ultimately wasted time. People sitting in meetings, people doing who knows what else. So give your teams time and a chance to rest and recover, keep them refreshed so that you can cycle them in and out if needed, especially if this is going to be a drawn-out incident response. And then lastly, don't panic so much. I think that there's always going to be that little bit of panic, that anxiety that sets in. But at the end of the day, once you get into incident response mode, don't worry about what comes after that. This is not the time to worry about those what-if outcomes. It's time to focus on solving for the problem that's at hand. So as I wrap this up here, just a few links. This is some additional information on wildland firefighting. I figure if you work in cyber like everybody here at Source Zero Con really does, you know how to find good cybersecurity resources, right? But firefighting, probably not as familiar to you. One video that I highly recommend checking out, this is a short film called Unskilled Labor. This was recorded on a season working with the Hotshots. These are almost like special forces in the firefighting world. This gives you a good example of what it looks like to work on a fire, to be in a high demand position where you need to be at the top of your game to be able to help manage very, very large critical incidents. Similarly, another short film, The Fireline, Wildfire in Colorado, but then also some additional information just on ongoing matters related to wildland firefighting. Wildfire Today, National Interagency Fire Center has a ton of great info on just explaining the overall firefighting process for wildland firefighting. And then InsaWeb, the Incident Information System. This is a great place to check out all the different major wildfire incidents going on throughout the United States and get up-to-date information on where they're at in their response efforts. And with that, we're at the end. So thank you very much for sticking with me through this one and for checking out my talk. I hope that you picked up some new ideas from it that you can carry forward into your own organization to get ready for potentially for a destructive incident or any other kind of incident, really. If you're getting a positive takeaway from this on how you can improve your incident management program, then I am exceedingly happy. Feel free to reach out to me. You can probably find me pretty easily on LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. And just let me know your thoughts. Thank you.